Welcome to this rather well-timed meeting, Tories in Meltdown. It's an absolutely extraordinary situation with the Tories tearing themselves apart, having caused chaos in the financial markets, and of course, making all of us pay for the crisis that they have created. We have Lindsey German, Susan Newman, and Unjum Mirza to help us analyze this situation, what it means for us, what it means for the movements, what it means for the future of politics. I'm Faizi Ismail. I'm co-secretary for the UCU branch at Goldsmiths. We're coming to the end of a ballot period, and I hope that our union, as well as many other unions in the country, can take decisive action, because I think this is the only thing that's going to turn the situation around in our favor. We all know that if we do get a Labour government, it's going to be hardly any better than this government, given that the leader of the Labour Party has never really fundamentally disagreed with anything that the Tories are doing. So first, we'll hear from Lindsey, and then Susan, and then Unjum. They'll speak for about 7 or 8 minutes each. We'll have a discussion. They'll come back at the end, and then there'll be a couple of announcements. So we'll start with Lindsey.
Okay, thanks very much, Faizi, and thanks to everybody for coming. It is, as Faizi says, a kind of pretty well-timed and meeting on a sort of fairly momentous day, because I think not only are we talking about the third Tory Prime Minister in a year, and six in 6 years, but we're talking about what is really an existential crisis for the Tory party now. I mean, I think that, you know, the fact that Johnson and Truss have now both left pretty much in disgrace in terms of Partygate, and then the whole complete shambles that has marked Liz Truss's short tenure of power from beginning to end. And whoever takes over, we know that it is an extremely contested party. It's an extremely divided party, and it's a party which, having listened to a whole number of the MPs today talking about things, are still absolutely determined not to have a general election. I mean, quite an incredible situation that, you know, they say we've got a mandate. Well, they haven't even got a mandate for each other. They can't agree even on who the Prime Minister should be, let alone let the rest of us, the millions and millions of people in the electorate in this country, have any say at all. And of course, the reason they don't want to do it is they know they would receive a humiliating vote. I guess that whenever they do have the election, there will be a humiliating vote. And I don't see any way that it can last for another 2 years with them in this kind of position. But obviously, Susan and Unjum are going to talk more about some of those kind of issues. But I just think we do need to look at this. The Tory party was the most stable party and most successful party of any party really in Western Europe and the United States. It's governed this country for the vast majority of the last century, and has been the majority government for most of the time. It's been very, very stable in that sense. Now we're seeing exactly the opposite, and we're seeing all sorts of divisions which are now coming out. The issue, there's lots and lots of issues what it's about, but obviously at the very minimum, we're talking about the immediate problems of British capitalism, and those are quite severe in terms of the issues to do with low productivity, the issues to do with the weakness of the economy in all sorts of ways, but also the political weakness. I mean, people sometimes talk about the situation in the Tory party as just stemming from Brexit, and obviously Brexit has been a very, very big division within the party and has caused it immense problems. If we remember, David Cameron's referendum in the first place was an attempt to deal with those problems. It had the exact opposite effect. But I think we have to see the Brexit phenomenon, if you like, as a symptom of the weakness of the Tory party and not a cause. So it was the Brexit vote, the whole move towards Brexit, all of those things was actually trying to deal with the much more deeply underlying problems of British capitalism. And I think therefore it's wrong, as a whole number of liberal commentators have said today, oh, this all started with Brexit. It started long before that, and it started with the failure of even Thatcherism, which was successful in its own terms, but actually the major government afterwards was a failure. We then had 13 years of Labour government with Tony Blair. All right, he implemented a whole number of policies that the Tories wouldn't be unhappy with, but nonetheless they were out of power. And even in 2010, they could only achieve a coalition government. They couldn't even govern as a majority. So I think you have those kind of problems. You've also got the issue of the breakup of Britain, which is becoming more and more obvious, that particularly with Scotland, it seems to me that any election is going to signal a very strong vote for independence. There's a growing movement for independence in Wales, although it's much less pronounced than in Scotland. And of course, the whole question of the Northern Ireland question, the question of a united Ireland, it seems to me this is only years away, and that will be the breakup. You're talking therefore the breakup of what's supposedly called the United Kingdom. And so all of these big problems now facing us, and therefore we're in for a period of massive instability, both politically and economically. It's clear that they're saying that whoever kind of gets to be Prime Minister, Jeremy Hunt, the man who ruined the health service, is going to be the technocratic chancellor. That looks like he's pretty safe in that particular job. And the aim of that technocratic government and the aim of the budget on the 31st of October is to discipline the workforce, and is essentially to ensure that working class people pay much, much higher proportions than they're already paying to bail out the economic system. And therefore, I think we're heading for a situation which is going to be much more like Italy, much more like Greece in recent years. These are the kind of comparisons that I think we should be making. And that is something that is a relatively new phenomenon for British capitalism. We've also had since 1945, a relatively stable setup of two main opposition parties, and that's broken down and fragmented in recent years, particularly with the rise of the nationalists in Scotland and Wales, but it still has pretty much held. That may well be under all sorts of pressure as well. Starmer, it seems to me, would be very, very unlucky not to get a clear majority at the next election, if you look at the polls and if you look at the discontent with the Tories. But for those of the older people here who remember the split from Labour in 1983, the Social Democratic Party, which was a very right-wing Labour split, all of Starmer's policies, both in terms of economics, in terms of civil liberties, in terms of whatever way you want to look at it, are to the right of the SDP 40 years ago. So this is the situation that we now face. What does it mean in terms of how we fight back? Well, I think the first point is that although personally I would much rather have a Labour government than a Tory government, the truth of the matter is that we will still have to fight many of the things that we're already fighting: austerity, attacks on strikers, attacks on trade unions, increased poverty. We will have to fight that in under a Labour government as well. And if you look at Starmer's attacks on the left in the last year or so, it's very, very clear that one of the things he's wanting to do is to drive out any vocal opposition inside the parliamentary Labour Party, so that if there is a Labour government, it doesn't have to depend on the votes of the Socialist Campaign Group and those sorts of people. He's also making a huge play towards nationalist, imperialist and pro-war policies. I mean, Labour has always had these policies, to be perfectly honest. Jeremy Corbyn was a big exception to that, not the rule for Labour. But actually, when you look at the way in which Starmer is very, very keen and will support increased defence spending, the shameful resolution that went through the TUC yesterday, admittedly only very, very narrowly, but which calls for increased defence spending supposedly to protect jobs, even though nearly all the money in that defence will be going to America and not to jobs in this country, because that's where most of the weapons are bought for. I think we can see exactly how things are shaping up. What does it mean for us? It means that we have to recognise we're in a new phase, and it requires the left to really step up. It isn't just about getting Jeremy Corbyn elected. It isn't just about whether we can have a strong Labour left. It isn't just about that. This is an existential crisis for the Tories, but it's also a very, very serious crisis for the left. And the truth of the matter is that the strikes that are going on now are very, very welcome and very, very important, but we're still not seeing a real breakthrough in terms of the changing quality of the strikes. There's been a lot more in terms of quantity, but we're talking about 1, 2, 3 day strikes, whereas we need to think about how we can really hit the capitalists and the government economically. We have to talk about much more politics on the streets in terms of the demonstration the People's Assembly is called on November the 5th, I think is of increased importance. And one of its main slogans, I would have thought, has to be now general election now, because that the basic questions of democracy has been completely hollowed out in all the major capitalist countries, but particularly acutely in Britain, that this appalling cabal of Tories can decide for the rest of us who is the Prime Minister and will continue to try to do so. I think the final thing is there is a premium on left-wing ideas, and there's a premium on left-wing organisation. I think we have to fight for building socialist organisation, building the influence of Marxist ideas, and actually talking about not just how we stop the Tories and stop Starmer, but also how we build an alternative to this rotten system. Thank you.
Thanks so much for that introduction, Lindsey. That's brilliant. Okay, so next we'll hear from Susan Newman.
Thanks, Faisie, and thanks so much, Lindsey, for that. Yeah, I want to sort of go back and as Lindsey said, let's think about, understand the current situation in relation to a very longer term crisis of capitalism, British capitalism in particular. And I think what's been really compelling to me in the last month or so is not just that financial markets can turn against the government. We've seen that in the past, but that financial markets, but this seems to be an acceptable thing to large parts of society. That if the government does something wrong, the markets will somehow bring them back to shape. I mean, this is something I've not really heard to this extent in the past, and certainly not since the global financial crisis. And I've also been really compelled by the lengths to which the Bank of England has played to protect the value of assets as well. I think these are really, really new and very current. And I think for me, they illustrate really the centrality of finance and the extent to which all of our lives have been coupled to asset prices that come about in financial markets. So whilst, interest rate increases and the increasing cost of borrowing clearly has effects on mortgages, but we also had the risk of entire pension funds folding with no intervention from the Bank of England, supposedly. So I just wanted to go back a little bit to sort of understand the basis of the crisis. And I would see this as a crisis that's really, this is the sort of latest episode of something that was clearly very much already in train in the 1970s, when Britain came out of crisis in the 70s via a neoliberal programme implemented by the Thatcher-led government at the time that appeared to revive profits for capitalists, but that this was on the basis of very radical restructuring of the economy, a shift away from industry and producing things towards finance and speculation. And at the base of this, as we know, was a major attack on workers and a reduction in the slice of the corporate revenue pie going to workers as wages. So what economists called the functional distribution of labour, going much more in favour of capitalists than to workers. But this was really about revitalising profits in a situation where profitability itself was in decline, and the rate of profit itself was in decline. But this was also the basis in which the City of London was revived as well, because we also saw the collapse of the Bretton Woods system of capital controls, which meant, this crisis in the 70s, which was initially triggered by the oil price hikes under OPEC, but this also provided the opportunity for resurgence of the City of London on the basis of recycling petrodollars, so this OPEC windfall for oil. And the UK saw a swathe of financial deregulation that led to it becoming a major hub for money laundering, tax avoidance and speculation over the next 4 decades. And we've seen this fueled really by Russian assets flowing in to be laundered, and also Chinese surpluses over the last 2 decades or so. And this is really, this really tells us a bit more about sort of the role of the financial market in the UK and the role of asset prices as well. I mean, this is not a financial sector or a financial system or a credit system that, for example, Marx saw as really integral to capitalist development, in terms of the provision of credit. But as Marx also saw, the credit system could be a major lever of overproduction or over-speculation, the basis for the contradictory nature of capitalist production itself. So what we see as a financial sector that's not growing in the UK, wasn't growing from the 70s because bankers and financiers were providing credit for productive activities and claiming back a portion of this profits as interest. This is a financial sector that's been inflated by hot money, products of theft, for example, formerly public assets in the case of Russian oligarchs, and the monopoly extraction from other parts of the world, particularly the global south. And this has been played out, this contradiction between finance and production has been played out intensely over the last 40 years plus, and was laid bare, and many of us will remember, in the 2008 global financial crisis and its aftermath in the UK. The policy response last time was to bail out and fix the financial system, pump money into the economy through QE. And from 2010, this was funded by austerity cuts, along with further QE that produced and entrenched even more extreme inequalities across society. The productive base of the economy was left to stagnate and restructure in ever more exploitative ways. For example, the rise of the platform economy, gig work, and wage repression. So this is a state we're in now, in a much more weakened and stagnant kind of productive base in the UK, and an even greater kind of reliance on finance, which in itself is overinflated, but also, I would argue, is drying up the opportunities to keep plugging the major sort of current account deficit by finance is clearly not working for the UK, and it's really reaching its limits. So we're in a situation where the financial prowess of the UK is called to question. We've reached the limits of plugging our current account deficit. The fact that we don't produce anything or enough with finance capital is reaching its limits. We've got a major cost of living crisis fueled by price increases that have happened largely as an international phenomena, but worse and deeply in the UK because of the nature of inequality. I mean, the UK, I've not got the figures here, but it's really extraordinary how the difference between the experiences of the poorest 10% and the top 10% in the UK would experience price increases. We've got the largest divergence between those experiences than anywhere else in Europe. So the response to the Tory crisis this time is to offer basically two versions of neoliberalism. The now very famous trust version of extreme libertarian version, which I don't know if people remember was really championed by the Daily Mail. I remember getting on a train station and seeing the Daily Mail on the top shelf, and then Financial Times, The Guardian on the bottom shelf, and a clear headline: "At last, a true Tory budget." So I don't think that the trust sort of economic approach was not an anomaly. It was very much part and parcel of the Tory party and its strategy. But this has proved entirely unacceptable by British and international capital. We've seen that, and we've been offered a second version, a more traditional version, emphasising fiscal responsibility and a programme of what will be intense cuts. We know the outcome of that. Right? We know the outcome of that is that Liz Truss has resigned, which is great. Like, we're really happy that she's resigned, I guess. But it worries me. It worries me because what we're being offered now is what seems to be, or was what is presented as, something extremely reasonable compared to the trust the trust policies or the mini budget type policies. And this is a great concern for me, because what we also see is large numbers in the centre and sort of those with a more Keynesian approach to economic analysis falling behind this narrative now of fiscal responsibility and really accepting that. And we see that in the Labour Party, with absolutely no kind of criticism of the prospects of further cuts and fiscal responsibility. So as Lindsey said, the left really has got to go on the offensive. Right? It's really clear the Tories are going to go back to this catastrophic fiscal responsibility and austerity, which we're now in an even worse state than we were back in 2010. And basically there's nowhere for it to go. The result of any further cuts or any kind of programme along these lines is just going to lead to social breakdown. But so we do have to fight that, but we need to do that by arguing for an alternative that reminds us that whilst we're being told that these are anomalous events based, very much a product of contemporary forces, we need to remember that this is a long-term restructuring of capitalism, and in the UK, particularly the running down of the productive base. And we need to go back and argue for an alternative that really focuses on what the problems are and how we solve these in the interests of workers. And the heart of this is thinking about how things are produced and distributed across society and between workers and capitalists. Wages and the way in which goods and services are distributed. In most cases, we want lower prices. This is not the same as a degrowth or an anti-growth position, though, but one that stresses meeting needs over profits. I mean, my own personal view is that we're in such an unequal society in the UK that redistribution would actually go quite a long way to meet needs without requiring further growth. But at the same time, this is certainly, sorry, what's that, Faisie?
For a minute, Susan.
That's great, perfect. So I'm actually, this is my last sentence, I think. So I think really the major thing we need to do is to refocus on what the problems are and what would be the solutions in the interests of workers. We need to move away from the status quo where there's this kind of frenetic response to financial markets, which themselves reflect the interests of a minority. We need to de-link our own welfare and social provisioning from financial markets. And we need to get out on the streets on the 5th of November to start with.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. I realized I didn't actually introduce our speakers. I thought these speakers need no introduction. But Lindsey German is convener of the Stop the War Coalition. She's also a member of Counterfire. Susan Newman is an academic at the Open University. She's an economist. She's also a member of Counterfire. And finally, we hear from Unjum now, who is a train driver and a trade union activist with ASLEF, and also a Counterfire member. Unjum.
Thank you, Faisie. I'll be kind of brief because I'm really interested to see what people got to say. It has just been absolutely extraordinary what's been happening the last few weeks. 44 days, I think, Liz Truss has survived, and you have to remember the Queen. It was two weeks or so, wasn't it, with the Queen's death? So I mean, this is quite remarkable what's actually going on. But I think the first point about this meeting is just remembering something that Bertolt Brecht said in, I think it was the Caucasian Chalk Circle. It's our approach here isn't to assess the probable outcomes, but really to seek the alternative possibilities that coexist simultaneously in the given situation. And hence the importance of this meeting is really not just a class analysis of what's taking place now, but really injecting the importance of what's often forgotten from Marxist analysis is the second word that goes with class, and that's struggle. And that's the central point of this meeting, is class struggle and intervening, because there is an alternative to what's taking place here. So it's unashamedly a class assessment and a focus on struggle. The first thing that's worth mentioning here is some fundamentals. Is often seen, given the circumstances, we're often used to seeing what's happened with the Tory government, which has been battered from pillar to post by the markets and the banks. We're quite used to seeing this previously in terms of Labour governments or left governments, whether here or abroad, most recently in terms of Greece, famously here with the investment strikes and the run on the pounds in the under Wilson and Callaghan back in the 70s. And it really does expose where real power lies. Governments come in and they take office. The idea that they take power is a very different matter. And here we've got a glimpse of where real power lies, in particular in terms of where economic power lies, and very powerful groups of people who decide what's produced, who's going to be employed to produce it, how much they will earn, and the prices of these are outside of the scope of an elected government and within the scope of a very group of powerful groups of industrialists who control those industries, and you know, these people who basically can decide that they're not making sufficient profits. And we're seeing this in the Post at the moment. Post have been out on strike today, not making sufficient profits, and declare basically redundancies and mass job losses, and move their money elsewhere. The same individuals who can decide the kind of quick bucks they're going to make by investing money in property or commodity speculation, and drive prices up for the rest of us. You know, these are the same people who, to make a quick buck, can actually at the touch of a button see their money go abroad, and creating utter chaos for the economy here. So an incredible amount of economic power that we've seen, but it's also coupled with, of course, political power as well. And here, of course, governments operate under the auspices of a state machine. The head of the civil services, the governor of the Bank of England, the head of industries, the heads of the police, the army, the intelligence services, and etc. These are the kind of fundamentals that we've actually starting to get a glimpse of at this moment in time. And it really leads me to my second point, which is, I think we're all going to be covering the aspects of the Tories and the immediacy quite clearly, but I think we also got to try and project ourselves a little further forward in terms of what it means to be under a Labour government. Because of course, whilst the key demand is for, and I've come to the alternatives and what's necessary just now for a general election now, but this is all the same under a Labour government, but a Labour government which, frankly speaking, is offering not only not much different, but actually the choices we're getting here is between austerity Mark II, and lesser forms of possible austerity, and maybe scaling back on parts of the anti-union legislation existing, and that of which has been proposed by the Tories under Labour, and it's been done under the guise of the national interest. When Starmer speaks at the TUC today and talks about putting our country first. I'm not sure what he means by our. Well, actually, I do know what he means by our country. When he takes on the Tories for their failure in their patriotic duty, that gives you a clear glimpse of where Starmer and where Labour government will go. The idea that we have a national interest and a common interest with the likes of the bankers, with the likes of the industrialists, with the likes of the filth in the energy companies who are screwing all of us over, the idea that we've got any common interest with these people is a complete and utter nonsense. And what we need here instead is a class response to the crisis, actually to reject austerity in all shapes or forms. And that means also with our trade union leaders. See, I had an interesting, I won't mention names, but I had an interesting text conversation with a union official today who started off really well, general election now. And I put forward the proposal, and that's why we need to put on strike action for the 3rd or the 4th to come out officially. I'm an ASLEF member with the RMT on London Underground. Complete and utter silence. I'm sorry, if you argue general election now and then go silent on what's necessary to mobilise those forces, our forces, independently, as an independent force, then I'm sorry, that's not good enough. And that's my I want to come on to my final point in terms of the alternatives here and what's needed in terms of strategies. It's interesting at this moment in time, we're once again talking about strategies absolutely central to the struggle to move and shift the balance of forces between us as a class against the employers and against the government, shifting the balance of forces. The first thing is the strikes, as Lindsey has stated, this is a breath of fresh air, and with the RMT strikes back in June has shifted the entire tempo of the struggle on the industrial front in the country. But there's been some serious problems that are coming up. On the 1st of October, let's start the other way around. On the 1st of October, we got a glimpse of our potential as a class when we coordinated all the rail unions, the docks and the post out on strike together. An absolutely incredibly powerful strike. But what we've done since, we coordinated that, but what we've done since, instead of using that as a platform to further extend and escalate that model, the 1st of October is at the moment become a bit of a symbol, a symbolic strike, as opposed to a platform to go further forward. Indeed, what's happened since is actually the strike dates between the rail unions and the post union and the docks has actually this ain't a word even, uncoordinated, as separated again, and we need to get that level of coordination back immediately and urgently, and then we need to also escalate that action. I believe if there was a direct confrontation at the moment between us, the unions, and the government would lose, hands down. And that's what we need, and that's why we need that escalation so urgently. And there's other forces on the industrial front coming through as well. In the NHS, the RCN are balloting, and their ballot is due to close early November. There's disaggregated ballots in Unite and in Unison in Health coming forward as well, in education, in the universities and in the schools and etc. So these are huge forces on our side that can shift the balance of forces decisively against the government. That needs to be coordinated, that needs to be escalated. That is absolutely essential to any strategy. But the second part of the strategy is absolutely necessary. Okay, absolutely necessary, and we'll all talk about this, is we need the maximum amount of unity across our class as a whole, combining as many struggles on the 5th of November as part of the People's Assembly demonstration. And that means joining in, mobilising and marching together with joint demands. One is, of course, general election now, seizing the profits of the energy companies, nationalising energy, nationalising rail, nationalising water, and etc., mobilising those forces. But the very last aspect, I believe, is if we're serious about actually building within this the possibilities of an alternative society and actually a glimpse of how society can be organised differently, rather than on profit, parliament and privilege, but that of our needs, then actually we also need a revolutionary organisation, and that's why joining Counterfire is so important.